do you feel obligated when you write a column to cater to your prescribed target? So you being conservative, Mr. Goldberg, would you necessarily argue for the conservative point of view, or do you ever dissent?
I dissent from conservative conventional wisdom all the time, but I'm still a conservative. And I find no obligation to, in the spirit of bipartisanship or even handedness, to take positions I disagree with. And so sometimes I'll criticize my own side, but it's very rarely because I agree with liberal arguments about conservatives. It's because I think that conservatives are making a mistake or seeing the issue the wrong way and all the rest. And I think that and Peter's a much more sort of serious guy in a lot of his writing. I think there's a role for entertaining, the reader, and also informing the reader and making their arguments. And I think I try to do all three to the exclusion of none. But I'm a conservative, so usually I come down on the conservative side of things, and I see no reason to have a problem with that.
I think that the problem is that most people don't have enough time to really understand all the different issues. And so what they tend to do is they tend to rely on certain people to kind of, who they trust. And those people are people on their own side, by and large. So it's like, okay, this has come up, well, why don't I'll go and check in with this person I trust, and this person, because this person on this side, they will explain to me. I remember I had this conversation once, years ago. I had this conversation with this guy, and he was making some arguments. And I thought I was making these great arguments and just kind of knocking down what he said, and really and he said, I better go talk to someone who can explain to me why you're wrong. Who has the same point of view as me. And I realized, well, that's actually what a lot of people will often do. He says, all right, well, let me go find Jim over here. He understands this stuff better. He'll tell me what I want to think is right. As much as people don't want to admit it, there is a team psychology that comes into play. When you guys, the other people are saying things, and you generally distrust those other people. Then you're just it's a fascinating thing when you find conservatives say, why don't we win African American votes, even though on these certain issues we show that African Americans actually agree with us, like school choice or abortion. I think the answer is actually that the messenger is so distrusted that the fact that Republicans hold these positions means that leads African American voters to distrust the positions themselves because they're so distrustful of the messenger. And I think that's what happens a lot. I think one of the things that's really, to me, a lot of the most interesting intellectual figures are those people who've really had a radical change in their view. And it's striking how many of the really important political intellectuals in the 20th century in America did at some point radically change their point of view. And I think in some ways, one of the, really valuable exercises, if you have a certain point of view, would be to sit down and write down on a piece of paper, what are the things that could happen in the world that if they happen, you would really have to rethink some of the basic ways you think about things. And I think that's, too often, there in fact are none of those things out there. People just manage to this is what people hated about the communists so much. The communists were just kind of able to slide by with, no matter what happened, and kind of, assimilate it into their point of view. And I think a certain generation, a certain generation of Democrats and liberals, were forced to be more self-critical and I think more intellectually honest because they actually did see conservatives be right about some things. It's a generational experience. The Gulf War, which most Democrats opposed. Welfare reform turned out not to be the hideous, terrible moral blight that many smart people thought it would be. The Cold War is more complicated, but even on the Cold War, Ronald Reagan didn't blow up the world as many people, liberals, thought he would in the early 1980s. And I think that this generation of people on the left, I think one of the things that I really blame the Bush administration for is the Bush administration has not done anything well enough, I think, to actually force liberals to reconsider things. They've in fact played into so many natural inclinations of liberals, it's made it too easy. And I think that they have forced some conservatives to rethink something a little bit, but I still think not nearly as much as I would like, given what I perceive to be the scale of the failures.
Failures, that's a big word. Like, what do you mean by failures? Are you talking about the Bush administration in particular? Or?
Yeah, the Bush administration in particular. I mean, here we're just going to get into, anyone can round this off, but I think the failure to respond to global warming has been a disaster. I think the way in which the Bush administration set about, and this is really Dick Cheney, I think more than anybody else, set about thinking about how America is going to respond to the human rights issues in the war on terror have been an absolute unmitigated disaster. I think Hurricane Katrina was abysmal and was partly the result of Bush putting people in positions who, partly a culture, I think, in the Bush administration that didn't take some of these jobs very seriously, only really thought of them as significant, if significant at all, because of their political impact, but didn't actually care about the policy involved and the actual running these domestic agencies. I think the Iraq War, even though the surge has gone much, much better than I thought it would, I still think has done enormous damage. And although I think there's bipartisan blame on the financial crisis stuff, I do think that there was a massive failure by the Federal Reserve and the SEC to recognize the implications of this huge new market that had developed that was largely unregulated. So I think those would be some of the high points.
Okay. So in talking about the financial crisis, particularly, what I saw happen is right after 9/11, right after the attacks on 9/11, we had this ridiculous drop in percentage rates for loans, for a prime rate, right? So what it looked like was we were trying to put faith back in the American people to go out and get these loans. So was it President Bush? Was it Bernanke? Like, who was it that decided that we were going to be able to have these super low
Such low interest rates. Well,
I think you're confusing an issue here. I mean, after 9/11, what you're talking about was the interest rates went down, right? Which, yes, affected mortgages, but also affects a lot of other things. And I don't think there's any economist out there who would disagree with cutting interest rates right after the 9/11 attacks. It's how delayed they were and then raising them afterwards. Because it was an enormous blow to our economy. They basically blew up Wall Street, right? And everyone was terrified, and there was a real fear that it was going to knock us. We were just looking maybe like we were getting out of recession, and then all of a sudden, people were afraid to fly, people were afraid to commit to, business enterprises. And one of the things Bernanke, who was not the chairman of the Federal Reserve then, was Greenspan, but he's a great student of the Depression. One of the things I think there's a bipartisan consensus on is that one of the reasons that the Great Depression was so deep and long was that we didn't cut interest rates. We didn't get more money out there to help jumpstart the economy. And so I don't think there's any real linkage that you can make between the subprime thing and 9/11. It's later. It's 2002, 2003, 2004 when we start getting the signs of inflation. That all of a sudden there's a very strong argument that maybe we should have, and the housing bubble was really getting out of hand. That was when we should have started cranking up interest rates, and we didn't. And how political that was, or how much you want to lay that on conservatives or any of that kind of stuff, there's an argument to be had. But I don't think it was there's a really hard connection between 9/11 and any of that.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think it was partisan.
Chuck Schumer was against lower interest rates after 9/11.
No, there are things that Alan Greenspan did that I think were partisan, like endorsing the Bush tax cuts. Sure, that was very bad. But I think that decision was not a partisan. And look, I wasn't smart enough to at the time. I wasn't screaming bloody murder at the time, goodness knows. But I think in retrospect that there are a lot of smart people who now do think that was a real contributor to this. The fact that we didn't raise interest rates more quickly once we realized that 9/11 wasn't going to sink us.
You were pointing to the lack of regulation as a result of this financial crisis. But isn't really the spirit of capitalism, quote unquote, the idea that you have a market and then people make decisions, and based on those decisions, they either suffer for it or they profit from it. And by providing a $700 billion bailout, wouldn't it basically be saying like, oh, so some drug guy gambled away a bunch of money, but you give it back to him?
Well, there is that danger, and I think that, to be fair, they tried to structure the bailout in some ways that would prevent, CEOs from these places from making a lot of money from it. The problem is that there are often lots of innocent bystanders. I mean, if you allow people to make cars without brakes, there'll be guys who will sell the cars, and there'll be people who buy the cars. And yet that shouldn't be allowed to happen. So I think that it's true that it's important in capitalism to be able to lose as well as win, and there is a danger with bailouts that you basically create what's called a moral, that you lose the kind of moral hazard potentially. But there's also a point at which the systemic damage is so great to so many people who were innocent that you have to do something about it. And I think that it seems to me the point of wise regulation is to make sure that even though people can make money and lose money, that they can't do so in a way that's going to wipe out large numbers of innocent people. That's one of the things you want a regulatory system to try to do, so you don't need to have this kind of bailout. But we found ourselves in a situation where we for various reasons that Joan and I could argue about, hadn't done that. And a lot of intelligent people who didn't have a partisan axe to grind believed that basically the credit markets might freeze up no matter what we did, but we're much more likely to freeze up if we didn't do anything to basically take all these bad loans off of the books of these companies that basically were seized with panic because they had all of this worthless paper on there. And so I think that was the reason it was worth doing. But it's also worth noting, something which is a really obvious point, but was often not made on the cable talk shows, was that we were buying something. We have bought something, the federal government, with this $700 billion. We have no clue how much it's worth. And that's a very, very, very complicated question. And a lot of it has to do with what accounting rules are used. But it's worth something. So by definition, it's not worth zero. So it's not $700 million. And there are actually some quite intelligent people who think we might actually make a profit from this. I wouldn't say that's the conventional wisdom, but
it's not a crazy position.
It's not a crazy position either. Yeah, and I certainly don't know. But there are people who are smarter than me who think that's possible.
But another thing, regarding the $700 million is that kind of what I see it is that all these banks failed because people lost confidence in the banking system.
Mm-hmm.
And by kind of forcibly injecting $700 billion into the system, I don't see that really restoring the confidence in people. That's just saying, oh, government's kind of giving money, but it's not, because it's not the people giving the money and saying, oh, we believe in you, banks. Here's, it doesn't really seem that this could be much of a help in the really large problem of people just having not trust these banking systems and these institutions and been like, these guys are going to screw me over again. Why would I want to give them money?
Well, I think that the idea is that if you take this mountain of bad debt off of these companies' balance sheets, then they will feel comfortable in accruing more debt by going and lending. And the problem is that lots and lots of industries in the United States need credit and be able to function. I mean, you're a business. You basically, you make something. Someone puts in, asks you to make something. You make something. You have to make it first, and then they pay you. But while you're making it, you haven't gotten the money yet to be paid. You need a loan to be able to pay your workers. And so I think the problem that we're seeing, and the bailout may or may not solve, but was an effort to solve, was to stop that from all freezing up, such that basically businesses could not get loans, such that they basically had to stop functioning because so many businesses in the United States rely on loans in order to basically keep their operations going.
And sorry, just another last quick question. So this does this $700 billion set a precedence for the future that some companies decide to fall again that we feel are important to this economy? Would we be inclined to bail them out in the near future? What do you think?
Yes. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, look, John Boehner, I mean, the reason I'm staying a little quiet on this is that, you know, I don't want to leave everything in the locker room and sort of have this exact same argument there inevitably. But, you know, John Boehner, the House Minority Leader, when the bailout package first came out, before the House Republicans voted it down the first time, he said, look, it's a crap sandwich, but I'm going to eat it anyway. And it is a crap sandwich. It's just, it's bad, right? And I don't know anyone who can argue that it's good. But there are lots of times in life where a bad option is still the best option available, right? I mean, World War II sucked, right? But it was still the best option available in my likes and my viewers' likes, you know. Cutting off your leg is really a sucky option. Sometimes it's the best option. And the argument for the bailout is not that it's good, right? I mean, I think they could have, I think Peter's absolutely right, they could have sold it better. And to say, rather than this is a $700,000, you know, outlay, which is what they did because they're talking about in budgetary terms that nobody friggin' understands. They should have said, look, you know, what we're doing is, we're making an investment that no one else can afford to make right now. We're taking this stuff off their hands, and we can afford to sit on it until these mortgages pay themselves off. Because that's what we're doing. We're not buying bad mortgages. We're buying a huge barrel of mortgages, and we know that X% of the mortgages in there are rotten. And we don't know if X equals 5 or 2 or 20. But we do know that somewhere from 80+% of them are actually good. People tend to pay off their mortgages because they don't want to be kicked out of their homes. And they'll probably be more likely to pay off their mortgages, assuming that the entire economy doesn't go bust, if they think the IRS are the people who are going to come and foreclose on them, right? And so they sold it in a bad way. But that said, this bailout thing, I mean, already the Democratic rhetoric is, if we can bail out the guys on Wall Street, why can't we bail out the auto industry? Which is why the House voted for a $25 billion bailout for the auto industry. You're going to have this argument time and time again. I mean, conservatives, free market conservatives are pretty screwed for at least a decade on this, because it's going to be very hard to argue in a way that is understandable to the average voter. I mean, I'm perfectly fine making the argument about why Peter's wrong about this, but or why the Democrats are wrong about this. But I think that in a way that's politically saleable in modern American politics, to argue why bailout for AIG, the bailout for Freddie and Fannie Mae, the bailout for Wall Street writ large, all of these things were fine, but bailing out a hardworking family who's going to get kicked out of their house, or bailing out, you know, steel mills, is wrong. And that argument is going to be very hard for politicians to make, which is why I worry less about the idea that there's a huge moral hazard for the free market, for the Wall Street guys. I don't really understand this. Lehman Brothers doesn't exist anymore. Merrill Lynch was bought up, right? Goldman Sachs is no longer an investment bank. JP Morgan, one of the other ones is gone too, right? There are no major investment banks left in America.
What was that?
Except, well, they're now a commercial bank.
Well, they've joined
Right.
along with Morgan Stanley.
And so they're gone, right? And the idea that this is the kind of thing that these guys wanted to have happen, AIG is in government receivership. These guys paid a pretty serious price in terms of prestige, their own bottom lines, their shareholder value, all of that kind of stuff. The moral hazard for me is the political moral hazard, because I don't see how we can now stop the next, the next economic problem from being seen as another excuse for the government to get involved. And that's to me the real scary part about all this.
I'm not quite as worried as Johnny is. I mean, remember, this thing barely passed. There was enormous opposition, and it passed because so many intelligent people said that if it doesn't pass, we're going to be more likely to have the Great Depression. I don't think those circumstances are likely to reappear when if the American steel industry finds itself in trouble. So I'm a little bit less worried about it.
Yeah, I have my reasons for wanting to talk about that, but we will save those for tonight. Anything else?
We're going to go ahead actually and head over to eat dinner. So you were, maybe you're going to the dinner, but it's across the hall. So